First glance, it doesn't look like something that would shape history. It looks like a truck, a simple, dusty vehicle with thin metal panels, narrow tires, and a boxy cabin that feels almost primitive by modern standards. No sleek design, no dramatic engineering, just a machine meant to move from one place to another. During World War II, vehicles like these quietly appeared across roads, villages, forests, and long rural highways. They carried fuel, they carried supplies. Sometimes they carried nothing more than spare parts and tired soldiers heading somewhere uncertain. Many belonged to the German military, known as the Wehrmacht, and if you looked closely, you would notice something surprising. Most of them were not remarkable machines. Some were sturdy models like the Opel Blitz, built to handle heavy cargo across rough terrain. Others were smaller staff cars such as the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, designed for mobility rather than comfort. But many vehicles used by the Wehrmacht were not purpose-built military machines at all. They were ordinary civilian trucks and cars taken from factories, farms, and city streets. At a distance, they blended into the landscape of everyday life. And that was exactly the point. War is often remembered through dramatic images, tanks rolling across open fields, or aircraft filling the sky. But much of the war moved quietly along narrow roads on vehicles that looked completely ordinary. Small trucks, simple cars, unimpressive machines that rarely appear in history books. Yet without them, armies would have struggled to move, to supply themselves, or even to function. Because sometimes the machines that matter most in war are the ones that look the least important.
At first, it might seem obvious why an army would rely on trucks and cars. Armies move, supplies move, people move. Vehicles simply make that possible. During World War II, military trucks quietly became one of the most important tools on any battlefield road. They carried fuel to distant units. They transported food, radios, and medical supplies. And they allowed officers and messengers to move quickly across wide territories. But here is the surprising part. Despite the image of a powerful, modern war machine, the German army, the Wehrmacht, never actually had enough military vehicles of its own, not even close. At the start of the war, Germany's industry could not produce the enormous number of trucks needed to support a rapidly expanding army. So the Wehrmacht did something unusual. Instead of relying only on standardized military models like the Opel Blitz, it began absorbing vehicles from almost everywhere it went. Civilian delivery trucks, farm transport vehicles, city cars, and later, after moving across parts of Europe, thousands of vehicles originally built in countries like France, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia suddenly found themselves serving inside German military convoys. In fact, historians estimate that the Wehrmacht operated hundreds of different vehicle types during the war, each with its own engine parts, tires, and maintenance needs. This created a logistical puzzle unlike anything modern armies would tolerate today. But at the time, the priority was simple: movement. It didn't matter where the vehicle came from. It didn't matter if it looked like a farm truck or a military transport. If it could carry supplies down a narrow road, it had value. Because in war, the ability to move often matters more than the machine doing the moving. And sometimes an army advances not because of perfect equipment, but because ordinary vehicles keep rolling forward. When in war, survival often depends on small signs of stability. Not dramatic victories, not powerful weapons, but simple things that reassure people the system around them is still functioning. During World War II, the vehicles moving along dusty roads did more than transport supplies. They created a sense of continuity. A convoy of trucks meant food was still coming, fuel was still moving, messages were still traveling between distant units. For soldiers spread across unfamiliar territory, that quiet movement mattered. The German army, the Wehrmacht, relied heavily on vehicles like the dependable Opel Blitz and the compact Volkswagen Kübelwagen. But their psychological value went beyond mechanical function.
A soldier standing beside a quiet road could hear the distant rumble of engines long before seeing the vehicles. That sound alone carried meaning. It meant movement. It meant connection. It meant that somewhere beyond the trees or the hills, the larger structure of the army was still active. Without that reassurance, uncertainty could grow quickly. War places people in environments where communication is limited and information travels slowly. In those moments, the appearance of even a simple truck could calm a tense situation, not because the truck was powerful, but because it represented organization. Someone had planned the route, someone had loaded the supplies, someone expected the vehicle to arrive. That quiet chain of decisions created something soldiers depend on more than equipment: predictability. When convoys continued to move, the war felt structured. When roads fell silent, uncertainty began to spread. And sometimes the difference between calm and anxiety in wartime came down to something remarkably simple: the steady sound of an ordinary engine moving down a distant road. In the summer of 1944, the roads of northern France were filled with movement. Columns of vehicles rolled through villages, across narrow bridges, and along tree-lined highways. Some carried soldiers, some carried fuel. Many simply carried the quiet weight of a war that was shifting direction. This moment came shortly after the Allied landings known as D-Day, one of the defining events of World War II. As Allied forces moved inland from the Normandy coast, roads across the region suddenly became strategic lifelines. And along many of those roads traveled long columns of vehicles belonging to the Wehrmacht. Among them were trucks like the durable Opel Blitz, along with countless civilian vehicles pressed into service months or years earlier. To someone watching from a distance, the scene might not have looked extraordinary, just vehicles moving along ordinary country roads. But the presence of those convoys influenced decisions happening miles away. Pilots scanning the roads from the sky looked for the faint shapes of moving trucks. Commanders studying maps tried to understand what those movements meant. Were supplies arriving? Were units relocating? Or was the army preparing for something larger? The trucks themselves did not make those decisions. They did not carry strategy, but their existence revealed something important. Movement meant intention. And in war, the direction of movement often reveals the direction of history. Sometimes the most important signal on a battlefield is not the sound of weapons or explosions. Sometimes it is something quieter: the slow line of ordinary vehicles moving steadily down a road, telling observers that an entire army is still in motion. War is often remembered through weapons: tanks, aircraft, artillery. But soldiers who lived through World War II often remembered something far simpler: the sound of engines. Not the roar of fighter planes overhead, but the steady, familiar rumble of truck engines moving along a road. For many soldiers traveling with the Wehrmacht, vehicles like the Opel Blitz became more than transportation. They became psychological anchors. A soldier marching on foot is exposed. He feels every mile, every hill, every moment of uncertainty. But a soldier riding in the back of a truck experiences war differently. The road moves beneath him, the engine hums, the convoy stays together. And strangely, that rhythm creates a sense of stability, even if the war itself is chaotic. Many German soldiers described convoys as moments of calm inside the storm of war. Sitting shoulder to shoulder in the back of a truck, men talked. Some shared cigarettes. Some slept. Some simply watched the countryside pass by. In those quiet moments, the war felt distant, just for a little while. And that feeling mattered more than commanders often realized, because war is fought not only with weapons, but with morale. An army that keeps moving feels alive. An army that stops moving begins to feel trapped. This is why vehicles had such a powerful psychological role. They represented motion, and motion suggested possibility, retreat, reinforcement, escape, or simply survival. There was also another human detail rarely discussed in military reports. For many soldiers far from home, riding through towns and villages in civilian vehicles reminded them of the world that still existed beyond the battlefield. Cars looked familiar. Trucks looked like the ones they had seen before the war. Those shapes connected soldiers to a memory of normal life. And sometimes that memory was enough to keep a soldier mentally steady during a conflict that otherwise felt completely unreal. In the end, these vehicles carried more than supplies and soldiers. They carried fragments of normalcy through a landscape defined by destruction. And in war, even the smallest sense of normal life can become a powerful tool for survival. At first glance, the vehicle system used by the Wehrmacht during World War II looked like a logistical nightmare. Thousands of different vehicles, different engines, different spare parts, different fuel needs. Military planners normally try to avoid exactly this kind of chaos. Modern armies prefer standardization, one truck, one system, one set of parts. But the German army in the early years of the war operated very differently. And strangely, that disorder worked, at least for a while. The reason was speed. Germany entered the war without enough purpose-built military vehicles, so instead of waiting years to manufacture standardized trucks, the army simply absorbed whatever it could capture or requisition. French delivery vans, Czech trucks, Belgian farm vehicles, civilian sedans from across occupied Europe. Within months, the Wehrmacht suddenly possessed one of the largest motorized transport systems on the continent. Vehicles like the Opel Blitz formed the backbone of the fleet, but they were only part of the picture. The rest was a patchwork. But that patchwork allowed the army to move faster than its enemies expected. Instead of waiting for perfect logistics, they used whatever wheels were available. It was an improvised solution to a massive problem, and improvisation can be powerful in the short term. However, the same system that created early mobility also contained the seeds of future failure. As the war dragged on, maintaining thousands of different vehicle types became increasingly difficult. Spare parts ran out, fuel shortages grew worse, mechanics struggled to keep unfamiliar engines running. What once gave the army speed slowly became a burden. But in the early years of the war, the system worked for one simple reason. Movement mattered more than perfection. And sometimes in war, the side that moves first changes the entire course of history. History often remembers war through its loudest moments, the thunder of artillery, the charge of tanks, the roar of aircraft crossing the sky. But some of the most important forces in World War II were far quieter. They moved on narrow roads, they rattled over old bridges, they rolled through villages that had stood for centuries. The vehicles used by the Wehrmacht were not always impressive machines. Many were ordinary trucks. Some were civilian cars taken from families across Europe. Others were work vehicles that had once delivered bread, tools, or farm supplies. Yet once the war began, those same vehicles became something entirely different. They carried soldiers, they moved ammunition, they kept entire armies alive on the move. In the end, the story of these vehicles is not really about engines or steel. It is about a simple truth of war. Armies do not move because of strategy alone. They move because something, often something very ordinary, keeps their wheels turning. And sometimes, the quiet machines on the road shape history just as much as the battles themselves.